It's my absolute honor and pleasure to invite Raghu on stage for the plenary. Clearly, the last 10 months, we've seen a phenomenal shift in how the enterprises have reacted to different business environments. Welcome, Raghu. Welcome, Raghu, on stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies.
Here.
Murphy's Law kicked in just as we were speaking. A whole bunch of things went wrong. So my sincere apologies. And thank you, Atul, for introducing Raghu. We're going to dive right into it, Raghu. Sorry, we wasted 2 or 3 minutes of yours, but I do want to get insights from your perspective on how the enterprises have seen sort of the pandemic change their thinking, and more importantly, how would you project this going forward as people start thinking about reshaping and reimagining the enterprises? Clearly, the work from anywhere, access information from different parts of the globe, data have all had very, very interesting changes. But how have you seen this over the last 10 months, Raghu?
Yeah, I think you hit upon some key themes there. Certainly, the first phase of this post-pandemic was all about resiliency and getting back on track. And I would say that's the first 2-3 months. And it was amazing to see how fast the business world adapted to working remotely. And speaking of VMware, for instance, we went from a population that was about 10% remote to 97, 98% remote overnight, and we didn't skip a beat. In fact, we saw increases in productivity, and that's by no means isolated to my company. So I think that was the first phase. The second phase, I would say, is adaptation and exploitation of this way of working. And clearly, we have seen this become the mainstay, and both the businesses and consumers alike becoming extraordinarily comfortable with this way of operations. And the implication of that for lots of industries was pretty profound. Just to take medicine, for instance, at least in the US, telemedicine was a huge flop before the pandemic came around. And now 70-80% of doctors' visits are done via telemedicine, and all indications are people are enjoying it. Similarly, you've seen the massive boom in e-commerce, the massive boom, of course, in video. How, for VMware, certainly it was a learning experience on how to do business with other businesses. But this has become new normal. Our teams are very comfortable having Zoom sessions with our customers, whether it's for pre-sales, sales, product demos, post-sales, you name it, right? So I would say this has become a comfortable, quote unquote comfortable, nothing is really comfortable given what's going on in the world around us, but this has become an accepted way of working. And what we have seen as a result is an acceleration of many of the trends that we've always talked about, but they have been growing more organically as a result of this, have been taken a fairly substantial leap forward. And you can see it in all the data, the growth of e-commerce, the adoption of cloud, right? The adoption of and the success of data-centric companies, especially on the cloud. The story of the last half of the year was probably the IPO of Snowflake from a business context, right? Yeah. The adoption of so I think those are some of the external manifestations. But what I also seen with customers, with businesses especially, is the rise of what I would call the software thinking and the product thinking. Because if you got to become a digital company, then effectively the core thing that you're producing is software that manifests whatever you're offering as a digital offering, right? And so the thing that Mark Andreessen said, 7-8 years ago about software eating the world,
Yeah.
really came true this year, I would believe, this past year, I believe. And along with it, the associated skills around product management was not just for Silicon Valley companies, it became for mainstream companies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when Goldman Sachs introduces a Marcus retail offering, all of a sudden it's become a SaaS company, right?
Yeah.
Customer experience has become a pretty um, mainstream topic amongst all companies, not just tech companies.
Yeah.
So I think the rise of technology thinking amongst what is traditionally non-technology thinking, the non-technology companies, I think has been one of the biggest changes, I think, and that change is not going back.
So two things, Raghu, from that. Clearly, the digital transformation acceleration happened across the board, right? I think to your point, it's not just the tech companies trying to adopt more technology, but all the non-traditional, non-technical infrastructure companies, adopted things much faster. What kind of conversations are customers having with you now as they move forward in terms of trying to plan their enterprise infrastructure or reimagining the enterprises? The one thing you did touch upon, which is almost every customer journey is now starting with potentially a digital touch point, across industries, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How's that shaping conversations for your customers with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to tell you the truth, a lot of customers are still in the here and now, but we have seen forward-thinking customers now thinking ahead, and there are a couple of macro global things to look forward to, right? Hopefully, the next year or so, um, vaccines have gone widely into people's arms, and
Mm-hmm.
we are seeing the decline of the pandemic, and that I think gives rise to a new um, mindset amongst consumers, which
Mm-hmm.
in fact goes all its way back into businesses. I think the second is there has been a massive stimulus, the likes of which has never been seen before for the last probably since World War II. I'm speaking
Financial
financial,
stimulus, you
right?
mean, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And today, a lot of that has gone into savings or into customer savings. For example, in the US, savings rates are at an all-time high. In fact, it was as high as 33% at the start of the pandemic. It's come down since then, but it's still historically higher
Mm-hmm.
than what it's been. And of course, there is still widespread unemployment. So when you have increasing ramp of re-employment, if you will, right, and customers feeling less risk, all of that savings is going to turn into consumption. So what we are going to see is a pretty significant, tremendous boom back in spend is certainly what a lot of customers are thinking about, or forward-looking customers are thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about the Nike swoosh, et cetera, but I think if you dimensionalize it, this is going to be a pretty substantial spend back. And you've already seen if you take China as a case study, right? You're starting to see that
Yeah.
already in China, since they've been one of the first countries to recover. So I think that's going to dominate enterprise thinking. It's point number one. I think what that means is that if you're not really prepared to react very rapidly to this new uh, spend patterns, if you will, and scaling, I think you're going to be left behind. And this is very often times when industry leadership changes, right? When there's such
Yeah.
a big dislocation. The second thing I would say is the new normal is going to be very different than the old normal, right? You and I are not going to go travel again for a 1 hour meeting across the country, right?
Yeah.
So it's not going to be back to physical. We have all gotten to varying degrees comfortable with digital. So the question really is going to be, how do you incorporate some amount of physical back into digital? It's not going to be how do you go back to physical and then retain some amount of digital. It's going to get flipped. And our lives won't be 100% digital or 95% digital like it is now. but it's certainly not going to be 20% digital.
Yeah.
It's going to be majority digital, complemented by physical, right? And I think that means that what customers have to think about, enterprises are thinking about is, how do I keep the best parts of what I've got today, and then add back things that are physical that are going to be game changers, not physical just because it's physical, right? I think that's really the process that I see a lot of forward-looking thinking companies going through. And what that means, though, is um, we go from a largely purely digital world to a world of digital plus physical. And things like edge, and then you throw in the technology accelerators like 5G and drones and so on and so forth, becoming standardized and becoming broadly accessible. So what I see is the rise of things like edge and so on becoming, in fact, the new normal for enterprises to deal with. A lot of enterprises that omni-channel has become the way of life. Real time has become the way of life. Reshoring of supply chains is becoming the way of life. All of these is going to drive the next wave of IT infrastructure investments. People are not going to go back from cloud. A multi-cloud we are seeing is becoming a mainstream topic because of the resiliency considerations, if nothing else, right? You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And security is taking on new dimensions because of this physical plus digital. So I think that's going to be the pervasive theme that I see customers going through over the next, I would say, 2 years.
I think you touched upon several interesting elements, Raghu, and one thing which I clearly thought is that you're expecting this massive surge in either spend and sometimes we refer to this as revenge tourism or revenge shopping or revenge holidaying. It's just people want to open the jail gates and people are going to rush out and go and indulge and spend. Clearly, people who design infrastructure and products which can scale to that requirement are going to edge out everybody else potentially, right? Which sort of leads me to the question around building products for that kind of a scale, right? The theme around the conference is Product Conclave. Clearly, the Indian software industry has, served Fortune 500, Fortune 100, Fortune 50 customers globally, helping, build capabilities for them. We clearly want to see more and more product mindset coming in. You've spent 25 years building products of, all shapes and sizes to the latest, cloud generation. And I mentioned to you earlier, I remember the day I downloaded Netscape, right? And for the folks in the audience who don't know, Raghu was involved with Netscape. Help us on how should people in the audience start thinking of the product mindset? What tenets have helped you, survive 25 years and you're still building products for the cloud scale and cloud infrastructure scale today?
Yeah, I mean, just a point on the previous one. I don't want people to think that the normal business cycles have gone away, right?
Yeah.
In fact, even as the spend comes back, you would expect inflationary trends to come in and then normal business cycles to catch up. So it's not all going to be all good news all the time. But back to this question, I think the definition of how the ability of how you scale is something that has changed substantially over the last 20, 25 years. And if there is one place where I think scalability means very, very different things than it did even last decade, is this dimension of scale in multiple ways. So, by the way, you asked me two things, one about scale and one about the product mindset. Let me briefly touch scale and then I'll go to the product mindset. To dimensionalize a scale, I think you've got all of a sudden ability for a single company, whether it's India or US or name your country, to get access to a global audience in a substantially shorter amount of time than it's ever been possible before, right? And then secondly, the rise, certainly in enterprises, the rise of developers has given rise to the consumption dimension that did not exist over the last, certainly even the last decade, much so the last 2 decades. So what that means is that if you build the products for the right with the right developer mindset, they increasingly influence infrastructure, right? Number one. And therefore, the equivalent of viral adoption in consumers is the viral adoption is developer adoption in enterprises. And then thirdly, programmatic access trumps user access, right? So this is not something that, again, was prevalent 10, 15, even the first generation of the web. The thing that everybody, when you said websites went out of business, the most likely reason was because user interaction was very poor, right? They were overwhelmed by the number of users hitting the website, overwhelmed by concurrency, and what have you. So I think these are the dimensions in which scale is very different. But the good news is the dimensions for handling scale are also very different, right? Open source and community is a phenomenal way to handle scale, right? Secondly, the rise of the business services as API-driven services allows you to scale your company, your product, meaning I'm assuming when you're talking about a product, you're talking about a SaaS-based service, most likely, a cloud-based service, most likely, right? So today, if you want to scale payments, certainly worldwide, you can use things like Stripe, or in India, you've got your own payment infrastructures, literally with 3 API calls or 2 API calls, right? If you want to send messages to your customers constantly, you've got Mechatrillio and mechanisms to do that, right? If you want to set up e-commerce, you've got mechanisms like Shopify, right? So the ability to build large-scale systems has become so much easier.
Simpler,
because you can in effect, the modern outsourcing of business services is possible due to these specialized API-delivered services, right? So the rise of a developer mindset allows you to scale much more, and open source allows you to scale much more. The rise of the gig economy allows you to scale much more. The rise of these services APIs-driven ecosystems allows you to scale much more. They have not penetrated as widely into enterprises, into mainstream enterprises. So when I talk to mainstream banks and logistics companies and healthcare companies and so on and so forth, they are further behind than consumer startups when it comes to using these services. And I think that's how they can achieve scale. So I think that's a pretty interesting dimensions to handle scale that are not available before. In terms of the product,
clearly the startups emerging out of India trying to reach the Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies would need to take advantage of all the scale elements you mentioned and the platform elements and the API elements you mentioned.
Yep. I mean, and by the way, we haven't talked about the cloud providers themselves.
Absolutely.
They provide you a pretty phenomenal scalable infrastructure. So
getting
I can
to the product mindset. You were jumping.
Product, or do you want to talk?
We'll talk about the product mindset.
Yeah. So one of the first things I learned about building products, it is, to use an old-fashioned term, it is an apprentice profession, right? So it's not something that you can go to business school for or some sort of product engineering school for and then come out being a full-fledged product manager or a product builder. It is absolutely an apprentice job, and it's the 2 dimensions of the apprenticeship being you learn by doing and learn from others, right? And hopefully you luck out having learned from your the bosses in the company that you are in as well. So that part of it does not change. So what I would say, the first aspect of product mindset is actually doing in a lot more dimensions than you were able to do before. So if you're a product manager today, you have to be a developer. If you're not a developer, you cannot be a product manager, because that's the fundamental way by which products are delivered to customers. It's not point and click, it's point and build, right? And you got to be on GitHub. And so that's, I would say, the first aspect of the product mindset. The second is, and I'm sure you can relate to it, and we all can point to a lot of common examples. There are two ways that you build great products, right? One is what I would call first principles thinking. Where you really ask by imagining the future, what if you could do X, right? By bringing together A, B, and C. And obviously the most prominent and fantastic examples of this are with the once in a generational entrepreneurs like Jobs did with iPhone, or Elon has done with electric cars with Tesla, right? Where you really break down the system into its constituent parts, really the basic building blocks, and build up and say, look, what if I could imagine something like this? And that is very much a product mindset. That's a very, very, unfortunately, for the world, it's a very rare mindset, right? But it is something that almost anybody that's in a product world has to employ to varying degrees at a time. The second thing I would say is customer empathy. This has not changed in all the years that I've been associated with building products. And what I mean by that is being able to think firstly from a customer in mindset, not from a company out mindset. But secondly, deeply, deeply understanding the context in which a customer is using, or a consumer is using the product, or trying to solve a problem, not thinking about the product, but thinking about the problem, and therefore what the value you can deliver, right? And the context in which they're using it alongside XYZ things, or they're using it in particular points in time, and so on and so forth. That's what I mean by customer empathy. And that has also become much, much more of a refined science now than it was before. I mean, things like design thinking are available as a science that was not available even a decade ago, I would imagine, right?
Yeah.
The third aspect of the product mindset is what I would call systems thinking, especially today's products are delivered cloud first, and when you're delivering products cloud first and SaaS first, the line between what is product, what is customer experience, what is distribution, what is business model, all of those things blur, and what is the supply chain, all of those things blur in a very, very, very profound way. And if you got to build a great product today, you cannot deliver a great product if you don't understand the systems thinking view, right? Because consumers, or businesses for that matter, they're not looking at just the features that you're delivering or the pieces that you're delivering, right? Go back to my earlier example. If you want to include notification in your product and you're using Twilio, right? Then Twilio is as much a part of your product experience as the code that you've built, right? So, so the systems thinking is pretty much a very critical aspect of the product mindset today. Earlier days, I mean, my first boss, Ben Horowitz, who's now a venture capitalist and an author, he used to call it the whole product experience. And that really, really differentiated good product managers back in the day. But I would say it's the table stakes for product thinking today. Is you really got to understand the systems thinking, right? And then the other thing about today's product mindset, I would say, is just as easy it is for a customer to adopt your product because of the frictionless nature of cloud and SaaS and so on and so forth. It is really easy for a customer to leave your product.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Churn rate, big challenge.
So you got to be really, really thoughtful about why does your product exist, right? And where exactly will you give fundamental reasons for a customer to come back to you over and over again, right? I think these are some of the things that are fundamentally different. but also some of the things that don't change. I mean, the story, you got to be a great storyteller if you're a product owner, right? And that doesn't change. And storytelling is not just about the gift of gab, if you will. It is truly understanding the value that you're delivering and being able to articulate it in a context that is relevant, emotionally relevant for your customer. And so those things don't change. They've never changed. And so anyway, I rambled on that answer
No,
for a
it's
little bit.
phenomenal. I think you've covered most of my questions, and in some ways, you also covered the advice question I had for students. I think clearly this is almost a master class for us, and Ram and Atul and I will chat about how do we take the elements of all this, systems thinking, the PM mindset, the customer empathy, and we're probably going to chalk it out. So this has been absolutely phenomenal. I'll just take 30 seconds more. Pat Kelsinger is probably one of my most favorite execs, right? I've had a chance to work with him. How's life with him?
He's an amazing. I mean, he's my boss. But more importantly, he's an amazing CEO.
Yep.
But even more importantly, he's an amazing person to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And for those of you that have the time, you should pick up one of the books that some of the books that he's written on his philosophies. And he's a phenomenal teacher as well. Yep. And I think he's been fortunate. He was fortunate, and he says this practically every day that I work with him, to have worked with Andy Grove. And so he's formed this pretty unique philosophy, watching and being tutored by the likes of Andy, right? Yep. So I think it's been a phenomenal experience for me.
The reason I bring that up is just to close on this session is that as we build our capabilities and startups and scale organizations, that kind of leadership is probably at core of any successful organization, right? So, Raghu, I thank you very much, and my apologies for the first few minutes. This was phenomenal. As I said, this could have been easily a 2 to 3 hour masterclass with you in terms of product development, and clearly we'll have to brainstorm on how to work with you to make that happen. So, on behalf of NASSCOM, our sincere thank you. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been great chatting with you, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghu.
Thank you.
Have a good day.